and in the diaspora.
Welcome, thank you.
Special welcome to newcomers. To explain, I have to explain at the outset that we have had enormous difficulty in terms of space. We're not aware of the technology, but we have resolved that. So last policy dialogue, it was oversubscribed to only 100, space for 100, but we are pleased to inform you we are now 500. And we are also live streaming on Facebook. And as usual, it will be available on YouTube. I want to begin also by, especially for the newcomers, to explain the origins of Surplus Trust. Surplus Trust stands for Southern Africa Political Economy Cities Trust. It began as a series.
Put on my ear plugs.
It began as a series of publications 36 years ago in 1987, founded by a group of Southern African scholars, Pan-African scholars, led by myself and Gabriel Mugabe, late Gabriel Mugabe from Zambia. So we've been 36 years in action. Having been
great video.
Born out of the African Association of Political Science, which was founded at the University of Dar es Salaam in 1973. And so SAPES was the Southern African expression of that organization. We are firmly linked to the global Pan-African movement. We are non-partisan, strictly non-partisan. People have been getting in touch with us, asking us if we're a political party. No, we're not a political party at all. Our mission, we are non-partisan, except for our mission, which is to expand and intensify the democratic space for political discourse, for intellectual endeavor, for media and academia endeavor, and strictly committed to Pan-Africanism as the way forward for economic development on our continent. Secondly is to explain the context, namely the Robert Gabriel Mugabe Centenary event. I almost said lecture. I'll explain shortly why it's not a lecture today. This is really in the tradition of honoring African nationalist figures. Last year, on Africa Day, we honored Herbert Chitepo on his centenary. The year before, I was part of a very large group of scholars and activists and politicians for the centenary for Julius Nyerere, one of Africa's greatest. And it was opened by the former president, Kikwete. It was a great occasion. And we thought, likewise, we should not miss the opportunity to honor the man, Robert Mugabe, whether one liked him or not. He's a historical figure. And as we can say conference, you cannot edit history. He was there. So we brought a panel led by Fei Chu, whom I will introduce shortly, to give an outline of the legacy, the good for which many of us remember him, and the bad for which many of us experience. But most important of all is to acknowledge history as we should in this case. Yes, we tried to have a centenary lecture, and we had variously Thabo Mbeki, who declined last minute, I believe because there had been a communication between him and the former First Lady, Grace Mugabe. I won't say much more about that, but we then got former President Obasanjo was prepared to come on condition that both government and the family were agreeable. I wrote to government on the 11th of January to the Secretary, to President and Cabinet, explained our mission, and sought to get the kind of protocol cover for former head of state, and also explained that we wanted to make it a big event, invite the Mugabe family, invite former leading nationalists, some of whom are still alive, like Lugare Gumbo, many of whom worked with Mugabe, Mubako, and so on and so forth. Now, and the letter was copied to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, whom I met briefly at a function. Well, to date, there's been no response to my letter, which were hand-delivered and also copied and hand-delivered to Grace Mugabe and the rest of the family. Amazingly, in short, there's been no response, not even acknowledgement of that. In short, our interpretation, our conclusion was that neither government nor Grace Mugabe wanted anything to do with such an occasion. So regrettably, we had to tell President Obasanjo, apologize that this is the position we are faced with. So we persisted, and here we are. And we have 3 panelists. The first, Fei Chung. Those who don't know her, Fei Chung was a member of the Liberation Movement, was in Mozambique, mainly in charge of education sector. She came into government, as a civil servant, we were together, and then she went up as a minister. She's an academic, an intellectual, written a book, Liberation Memories. It's very important, and she has produced a brief paper to assist us in the discussion. The Mugabe, the enigmatic figure, some of us have circulated obituary that we wrote on the day he died. There's one by myself, a long one by Sipho Malunga. There's a book by Kenneth Mfuka, who's joined us today. And there are many other commentaries on Mugabe, not surprising for a figure of his stature. Many of us are engaged in writing biographies. So I'm doing one. I'm fascinated by Mugabe's origins, family origins, including, as might surprise some of you, his Nilotic links with Southern Sudan and Uganda. Reflected also in his daughter, Bona. The name is singularly a Southern Sudanese name. Likewise, the second name, Uma, it's a Nilotic name that gives a hint to the origins, which are somewhat still shrouded in some kind of mystery, but as historians will unpack those. We have to look at his political career, a man who, in fact, rose against the odds, came out of detention and became almost an appendage of a liberation movement which was controlled by the military factor in ZANLA. And they had to abide by, as ZANU and ZANLA were controlled by the military, mainly in the form of one Togogara. And one has to admire how he navigated himself out of that and became the prime minister in 1980 and formed a cabinet which reflected largely the history of the struggle itself. And the scourge of Gukurahundi, largely a byproduct of nationalist rivalry from the 60s already, which was exacerbated in exile. I always say that ethnic politics was born and developed in exile, where the nationalist movements like ZAPU and ZANU, which were largely, almost entirely nationalist movements, national in the broad sense of the word. That ZAPU, for example, was larger in so-called Mashonaland than it was in Matipiland. But coming independence, these parties, ZAPU and ZANU, are almost synonymous with Shona and Ndebele, regrettably. And we're still in that rut. It has given rise to the most embarrassing, most wasteful, most disastrous scourges on our blots on our history, Ukraine being one of them. And Mugabe's quest, as Fei Chung will confirm, of trying to liberate ZANU from purely a militarist organization into a nationalist movement, which largely failed in Maputo days. We thought it had succeeded in the 80s, but clearly it failed. And by the 2000s, it had become virtually a hostage, maybe it's too strong a word, but became very dependent on the military to keep him in power. And the very military factors, the guys who cooled him in 2017, were the ones who preserved him like an egg, claiming that there would be no successor as long as he was alive. They were waiting for their chance, and they got it in 2017. Not to mention the role of his wife, Grace, a woman 41 years his junior, whom he married, who became a major factor in the complications associated with the transition. And indeed, holds a very strong, capable role in what happened, and indeed, in Mugabe's demise. We hope that the Grace Mugabe factor cannot be ignored or edited out of the career of this man, Robert Gabriel Mugabe. So I have introduced Fei Chung. I also have to introduce the other two panelists, Brian Kagoro, one of our leading intellectuals in Zimbabwe, a fine lawyer, and a leading Pan-Africanist on the continent, obviously since joined us. Also have Gerald Mazarire, in my view, one of the best historians in Zimbabwe, particularly on the history of liberation, although he was only a toddler during the struggle. And I'm pleased to say that I'm working with him on the history of nationalism in Zimbabwe. And then, of course, we'll begin shortly with a few words by Leo Mugabe, one of the few of the Mugabe family who have graced this occasion and joined us on Zoom. He's out of the country, but he has made effort to join us. And so I'll begin with Leo, just a few minutes to see what he wants to say, and then I'll move on to Fei Chung and the rest, as we always do. So, Leo Mugabe, Zuguru.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mandaza. I would like, obviously, maybe to apologize on behalf of my Aunt Grace Mugabe if she did not reply to your invitation. For all I know, she had been out for a while, but all the same, you know, even if she had replied, if government had not, in actual fact, replied to your letter to the Chief Secretary, still this occasion would not have arisen. But anyway, I apologize on behalf of the family. But anyway, I'm here now. I want to take the opportunity to thank SEPS, and in particular you, Dr. Mandaza, for this particular occasion. One would have thought that universities all over in Zimbabwe, we got maybe about 10 universities, they would all have thought of taking part in this sort of thing, but alas, they haven't. But let me take the opportunity to thank you very much on behalf of the Mugabe family. And also to thank the panelists that you chose, Faye, Chung, Kagoro. They are people that are well known in our history. Maybe for my part, President Mugabe was not just Sekuru to me. He was more than that. He was more like a man who brought discipline around all of us. You know, Vasukuru, his brothers, children, we were all well disciplined because he insisted that we be disciplined. And when some time ago, when Webster Shamu and them thought of coming up with the 21st February movement, you know, our interest was, why are you starting this movement? And he says, it's the discipline that your Ambuya Bona has always talked about in terms of Robert as he grew up. And I said, yeah, but we are also disciplined because he insists that we grow up as disciplined people. So there was a recognition for him, for the youth of Zimbabwe to grow up in a disciplined manner, no alcohol, no drugs, education was the emphasis. And so the 21st February movement was then born out of the realization of how important it was to be a disciplined child. And the youth of today, you know, we all hear what is going on in terms of drugs and everything else. So obviously coming up with this will get most of the people who are participating to go out there and say to their kids or children that, you know, be like Robert Mugabe, look what he did. He started off as a good Christian, a good student, a good politician at the end of the day, a good teacher. He was a teacher for most of his time before he went into prison, but even in prison, he continued teaching. And after independence, he continued teaching. You know, I'm sure Fei Chung will remember that people like Wopam Chinguri, you know, Maim Juru, were all taught after work. They would go to Zimbabwe House for lessons. He was teaching all the time. So that is the man that we all know. His political career, you know, I'm sure historians will talk about that, but his personality himself, as a human being, as a Sekuru, as a father, was that, you know, you needed to go to school, you needed to be, I remember myself when I wanted to start business, and he says, no, you cannot do any business dipping your fingers into tenders and things like that. You must do a business that is associated with your profession. And I said, but you know, my kind of profession as an engineer, you cannot just start by getting jobs. You have to start by doing other things. But he insisted. And you know, I listened, and this is where we are today. Dr. Mandaza, let me take again the opportunity to thank you on behalf of the Mugabe family, and apologize on behalf of the family again for whatever might have happened in terms of correspondence. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leo. Thanks, Mr. Gur. Thanks very much indeed. And thanks for reminding us on the origins of the 21st February movement, which has now been converted into a National Youth Day or something. And I was listening on the radio as I was driving, some big event in Mashingo, a youth thing, and I heard not even a single word about Robert Mugabe at all. The way the Zimbabwean polity has been behaving since the coup. Very strange. Almost, as most non-historians will try and do, is to delete history. Not even a mention of Mugabe today. And those of us who are accused by people like Grace of having been too critical against Mugabe during his reign, at least have the courage to honor history as we should. So here we have it. So Faye, lead us, please, my dear sister, into this discussion. Faye Chung. Faye.
Unmute.
Faye.
Unmuted. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
I can see.
I had the privilege of working under him for 10 years. So I got to know him personally, and as the head of government and the head of cabinet. So the first 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about his character. I think I can say that he was a person who believed and spoke about socialism, although he never actually defined socialism and capitalism in detail. But he spoke about socialism quite a lot. And I think this was because ZANU PF openly, and ZAPU as well, openly supported socialism as their main ideology. Now, the reason for this is straightforward. The Rhodesian Front had said they were the best representative of capitalism. So most Africans saw the capitalism of the Rhodesian Front as a racist system. And most of them wanted to support the opposite of capitalism, which was socialism. But I want to emphasize that neither the capitalists nor the socialists ever gave detailed explanations of what capitalism meant or socialism meant. Firstly, the influence of the Rhodesian Front, which was a powerful right-wing racist organization before and after independence, and it was in power for a very long period, almost 20 years. It had a powerful impact on Zimbabwe after independence, even in the characterization of the main African parties, because the Rhodesian Front was so powerful. The Rhodesian Front had 15 founding principles, which was advancements through merit, maintenance of the Land Apportionment Act. And this was the main aim of the Rhodesian Front, to ensure that the ownership of land would be controlled by the whites, and opposition to compulsory racial integration, job protection for white workers, and protection of Christianity. Those were the Rhodesian Front principles. I want to say one of the first things which affected government was the Willowgate affair, which was seen as corruption. Robert Mugabe, as the head of the ZANU leadership, decided that the funds of government would go mainly to ZANU PF. And this indeed happened. Of course, in terms of the legal situation, there is no law which says a particular party should get access to motor cars made in Zimbabwe at that time, but it was done. Cars were specialized to be given to ZANU PF. There was also no law which said selling cars secondhand is illegal. I'm pointing this out because the Willowgate affair had two main actions. One was the giving of the money to ZANU PF members. The other one was the ensuring that they would remain and retain it. Now, there were no laws to say that that was true, but it was done. What happened was nearly all the ZANU PF leadership had been involved in the purchase and resale of the cars. You have to remember that the control of the price of the car was low. It was then 18,000 Zim dollars. And there was a big shortage of motor cars in Zimbabwe. So people who had money, which included whites and blacks, were offering not 18,000 for the cars, but 400,000 for the cars. And those ministers who had bought cars, some of them bought one car, some of them bought more than one car, sold the cars at that tremendous profit. Now, this became well known, and it became the first so-called corruption case against ZANU PF, keeping in mind that actually no laws were broken. Then we have the Unity Accord, which took place without a written agreement in 1980, which was that ZAPU and ZANU would work together as one party, and the Unity Accord was actually signed in 1987, 7 years after it was formed. So it was an unwritten agreement for 7 years. When it was formed, the main points were that the two, ZANU and ZAPU, committed to unite under one political party. And I have to remind you that I said what the Rhodesian Front did, which was supporting one big party, became also the pattern for the African parties. Robert Mugabe was the first secretary and president of ZANU PF, and he held this position for almost 40 years. Sorry, I think it was 37 years he held that position. So it's true, it was almost 40 years. The ZANU PF said it would establish a socialist society under Marxism-Leninism. Now, this was these were the policies of ZANU. ZANU had also said it would have a one-party state. Both parties tried to stop the insecurity in Matabeleland. So the formation of one party in Zimbabwe called ZANU PF. Then the establishment of a large opposition party, the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC, and This took place in 1999 by trade unionist Morgan Tsvangirai. But in the next 2 decades, MDC became more and more powerful, and it indeed became the major party in addition to ZANU PF. In the 2008 elections, MDC won the elections by a tiny margin, and Tsvangirai became the president, with the ZANU PF representative becoming the prime minister. So this is an example of what happened in the first 10 years of ZANU PF. Now I'm going to move into the second part, which is the development in Zimbabwe after independence. That is from 1980 to the end of this period we are discussing, 2017. Robert Mugabe was the dominant leader, as I said, for the first 37 years, either as prime minister or as president. He was prime minister from 1980 to 1987. He was unanimously selected by the leadership of ZANU PF as the prime minister. And the prime minister was the dominant practical decision maker, whereas the president, who, as you know, was President Banana, was the dominant moral leadership of the country. So under the two, Comrade Banana and Comrade Robert Mugabe, we have the first ZANU PF government. The first 20 years, 1980 to 2000, can be said to be uncontroversial. That is, it was a success story politically and economically. We have to take into consideration that ZANU PF decided to join together with the Rhodesian Front. So a cabinet was formed with some of the top Rhodesian Front ministers, together with the ZAPU and ZANU ministers, to form a joint government. I think this was a decision made by ZANU PF because they knew that they did not have years of experience in running a country. So they agreed, and I want to emphasize the pattern of coalition, where they made a coalition with the Rhodesian Front. I say this because later, as you know, they made a coalition with the MDC. The main achievements of the first 20 years of independence, we all know, was health and education. These were social welfare and not economic gains. They are very important because under the Rhodesian rule of 100 years, Africans were not allowed full primary education. We had only primary education for 35% of the population before independence, and those were mainly men and boys. Women did not receive primary education or secondary education. Secondary education had to be paid for and was given by missionaries, and was so costly that parents could not send their girls to school. Nevertheless, under the system of the first 20 years, the first primary schools for all were constructed. This was based on a third of the costs being paid by government. This was for things like the things you need, like bricks, not the ceilings, but the roofing and cement. And these schools, the primary schools, 1/3 of the cost being paid by government, 2/3 by the community themselves. And as you know, the schools were built by the community. During the first 20 years, there was no major land resettlement, although a few small programs could have happened, but more or less no land resettlement took place in the first 20 years. I think the agreement was that everybody, chiefs, all parties, ZANU PF, and the Rhodesians would work together, and they did not have resettlement legally. But the first legal resettlement program took place 20 years later, around 2000, the year 2000, when the first law, which I think was passed in 2005, was that there would be the fast-track land resettlement program, which actually began in the year 2000, but the law was passed a few years later. There has been a study of the fast-track land resettlement program. These studies have not been full-scale. They have been done in the different districts by different groups. In other words, they were not done by government itself, but by different NGOs and different districts.
You have 10 minutes left. I would advise that you move on to focus on Mugabe's legacy for the last 10 minutes, please.
Okay. I think looking at the achievements of Mugabe during the period, we can say that the GDP of Zimbabwe remained more or less stable for the first, shall we say, first 10 years of independence. It was the same as the previous 10 years before independence. In other words, the aim was to retain the Rhodesian GDP, and it was retained at about $9 billion US. But there was a sudden increase in the GDP beginning in 2018. Interestingly enough, this was not done by government policy, but accidentally. Accidentally, more minerals such as gold, silver, and lithium was discovered and was exported unprocessed. And this increased the GDP to a new average. So the average GDP for the next 10 years, 2012 to 2023, was 26.82 billion. Remember I said for the first 10 years, it was around 9 billion. So for the next 10 years, it was around 27 billion. And I also said it was apparently accidental, not caused by government policy. Another feature is that the exportation all the time was unprocessed or underprocessed for various reasons, the new government was not able to process the materials they were exporting. One of the reasons was insufficient electricity. And this is another weakness of the government, that over the period of the first 20 years, there was no expansion of electricity for the country. Same thing with water supply. The water supply systems, like the dams, were built by the Rhodesians before independence. Now, what we can say, both about electricity and water supply, was that the post-independence government was very good at sustaining these systems, but they were not good at creating new electrical and new water supply system. The donation of Western aid was about 5 billion a year in the 1980s, which stopped after 10 years. This was very generous, except that nearly all of it went to food aid. None of the aid that was received went into the expansion of the economy. I think that tells us about the weakness of the whole period, the first 20 years of independence that I've covered so quickly. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Faye. Just one or two questions before you move to the next speaker. What would be your summary in terms of the legacy of Mugabe? How would you summarize it? You mentioned that you worked with him as governor of 10 years, but you and I knew him from the Mozambique days, and you knew him too, I think even before that. But in terms of his legacy, his life story, how would you summarize it in your view?
I would say that he was a very professional person, having spent 14 years studying at colleges and university. And after he joined ZANU, he again did more studies. As you know, he ended up with 7 degrees. So we can say without doubt, he was one of the most sincere intellectuals dedicated to gaining intellectual knowledge and doing research. I think that is his strength, and I think that the fact that he maintained all the systems that we inherited from the Rhodesians, he did not weaken or destroy them. He didn't say, well, the Rhodesians started good, electrical systems, so I'll destroy it and start my own. No, he carried on with what the Rhodesians had started and maintained its efficiency. So I think that is a plus. However, in terms of new electricity and water development, we don't see any. You would think that over a period of 20 years or more, we would know that we needed more electricity, especially with the Africanization of housing and Africanization of companies. We had no increase of electricity capacity, or we also did not build more dams for providing water to the cities. So I think that shows a weakness not only of a personality, but of the government as a whole. And you might well say, who decides to increase the amount of electricity? Is it the cabinet, or is it the political party, or was it ever discussed nationally? Because if you start saying we were supposed to increase the amount of electricity that would be used in the country to create more jobs, did we ever say what is required to create more jobs, and who would fund the amount needed for more electricity? Similarly, if we look at the dams we built, we did build some dams. They were middle-sized, beautiful dams, good for tourism. How many of them were used for irrigation? I think the answer is almost nil. We didn't think that Zimbabwe, which has 3 years of good rains out of 5, needs irrigation permanently. But we didn't do that. And again, I should ask, who was responsible for saying, well, we need to have funds for increasing electricity and water?
You raise a very important point, because it's very, in Western historiography, and indeed in analysis generally, they tend to emphasize the role of the individual beyond the role of the state. So it's very easy to blame Mugabe for this and that, or to praise him for this and that, including education, in which you and I were involved, without giving and I think you gave a good account of the Zimbabwean state as a whole. But what I want you to do was to look at the man himself, in terms of his, you have a paper, I should tell the viewers here, there's a paper that Faye has produced, and we'll make it available to anyone who wants it. I made it available to about 30 people already. So you can read more about what Faye has to say. But I want to just, for the sake of this discussion, Faye, just highlight what were his personal failings, looking at Mugabe's political history.
I would think his strengths and his failings are the same things. That is, he was a person who believed in working in teams. So he never told us, like we were the education team, do this in education or change the policy in that way. He believed, and I think rightly, that we knew which were the right policies and which were the right experiences on which we based the, as you know, we more or less doubled the number of schools and doubled the number of students who could go to primary and secondary schools. He expected us as the professional specialists to give him the answers. So he never dictated to us. I think that is a part of his character, that he felt he was not the know-all who would tell us what to do. We always went to tell him, because, of course, we changed some of the policies that were practiced under the Rhodesian Front, and we had to tell him it's going to cost more, it's going to mean this in terms of the budget. And we explained to him how we thought the budget would be affordable, because we also studied the budget. And of course, the European education system was 10 times more expensive than the African unit costs. Where a European kid was costing, say, $500 per year, the African kid was costing like $80 a year. But we lowered the cost to a reasonable amount and imposed school fees. School fees were imposed in secondary schools for the first time after independence. and everybody wanted free education, but we knew that with the amount of money we had, we couldn't do it. But we had to put in a system where the school fees would be decided by the parents who had to pay for it, and then agreed to by the ministry, and then approved by the government. And that's the system that is in place.
No, I'll come back to you towards the end, but I want you to just reflect. I want just about 2 minutes at the end, what you want to remember Robert Mugabe for, as someone who worked with him. I'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Is it Brian Kagoro, are you ready, or you want Gerald to go ahead of you? Brian? Gerald?
I could come in now.
Okay. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
Kagoro.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Somewhere in Nairobi, or which part of the continent are you now?
I'm floating. A good African always floats.
Yeah, you answer the question, man. It's a good answer the question. Where are you?
I'm on the continent.
Carry on, Brian.
Okay. Thank you so much, Faye, and thank you, Leo. In reflecting on both Faye's remarks and the brief remarks by Leo, I wanted to premise my few interventions on the following. As one who suffered from some of Mugabe's policies and Mugabe's actions as leader, but one who remains a committed Pan-Africanist, I thought that I should offer a disclaimer that says that I would liken this reflective on Mugabe to urge us to abstain from pathologizing Robert Gabriel Chatunga Mugabe. There are those who are Mugabe mania. Mugabe was an iconic leader without parallel to them. Mugabe was infallible. He was all-knowing, an astute professional and statesman, an unassailable socialist, Marxist, and Pan-Africanist. But then there is also Mugabe-phobia. Mugabe is seen as having been the arch-evil, obsessive, vindictive, actuated by malice and murderous. And in thinking about this, when they reflect on Mugabe's legacy, some reflect on the legacy of struggle, that of a fighter who fought till the very end, a principled man that stood for the liberation of Black people till the very end. And yet others associate Mugabe with the legacy of pain, the murderous incursion by the army by Gukurahundi, the genocidal acts in Matabeleland in the Midlands, the post-2000 violence, post-2008 violence. And indeed, they say, they that live by the sword must end by the sword, and referring to the coup that removed Mugabe. Either judgments seem uncharitable, affectual, and perhaps subjective. But how else do you judge a leader who has ruled you for 37 years, except through subjectivities with a little tints of objectivity? If I manage to do anything this evening, let me urge us to remember that there are many faces and phases to Robert Mugabe. Those who reminisce and remember him as a teacher, perhaps remember him differently. Some who remember him as a Catholic, a devout, religious man, ask themselves the question, was he a good Catholic? Well, that debate can rage on for years. And then there are others who remember him as a husband, a lover, a father, a sekuru, like Leo, like Bona, like Tete Ntombizotu Grace Mugabe. And then others remember him as a guerrilla, where people yearn for a patriotic history where there was a gallant fight against imperialism and colonialism, where rhetoric and speech and morale was driven by songs, by words, by images. Mugabe strikes a figure of a good guerrilla, a fighter. Some would ask, like Tekere, did he actually fight? Well, whatever answer we give, we can't deny that Mugabe suffered at the hands of the Rhodesian state. Some would say, as Ibo and Faye reflected, that is the phrase IMF, which simply means it's Mugabe's fault. A person has many kids unplanned and can't pay for them. It's Mugabe's fault. One is caught stealing. It's Mugabe's fault. So as a nation, we have this default IMF acronym, which says it's Mugabe's fault. But is it really always Mugabe's fault? Well, clearly, we know that state capacity to deliver, as Faye, you've said, not only energy, electricity, healthcare, and other basic services diminished after some time, having started on a great path. We know that the pathway of developing leaders within both the ruling party and government began to suffer diminishing returns, having begun. So the one thing we all cannot deny, whatever the causes, is that Mugabe had a great start, but Mugabe did not finish strong. There is in the book Serving Secretly, a Rhodesian writer and former director of the CIO alleges that President Chissano told him that Mugabe is not a Marxist like one of us. He's not one of us. Was Mugabe Pan-Africanist? For those who suffered the brunt of the violence in Matabeleland, for those within ZANU PF who alleged the intrigues of ethnic, ethno-regional, and tribal politics might differ. But for those that saw Mugabe send troops to the Congo, that saw him stand up for the liberation of Mozambique and others, they may hold a different view. So clearly, Dr. Mandas, it is important that if we are to judge Mugabe, we place him within a historical context of the Cold War that nurtured him, the context of a racist, fascist regime in Rhodesia that imprisoned him, and the viciousness of the war that created wounds that were indelible. The grave insecurity and the cost of the wounds and enmity and the suspicions born during the struggle for liberation that my sister Fei Chung has rightly recorded in her book, as have others. These intrigues could only have created resilient insecurity, whether that could explain ethno-regional atrocity or explain the clientelism, the nepotism, and the tribalism, or explain the racism and the universalization of certain goods, or the insecurity, the insurgency, and dissidentry. Well, clearly, there was insecurity in the east of the country. There was dissidentry in Matabeleland. And that's quite separate from whether Kukuraundi, that atrocity was justifiable. But it is important we do not conflate two things. The country gained its independence totally uneasy. The tensions within and amongst the nationalist fighters, unbearable. The machinations of the Rhodesians to ensure that you did not have a cohesive and coherent Black government, unrelenting. The naivety of including those whose racist views were that the native has no capacity to rule and we're not interested in ensuring that the government totally delivers cannot be mistaken. But we shall forever judge Mugabe on the basis that he promised, Gutsaru Shinji, that we would eat and live better than we did under Ian Smith. And at the end of the day, we had become the laughingstock of the continent. But Mugabe presided over an ideological amoeba or octopus. He presided over comrades who claimed like him to be Marxists, but engaged in the most vile primitive accumulation. Mugabe dealt with Western and imperial designs against his rulership, whether it was cooptation by knighting him and making him Sir Robert, where he is accused by others of complicity, or the ostracization that followed when he decided to take a position consistent with his liberation ideals and credentials, and the naivety of thinking that he would be left alone, or whether it was the consistent attempts to eliminate him and the overall attempt to alienate him, not only in his country, but internationally. It's clear to me that nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and defensive radicalism that we see as a spectrum of development in his life and the contradictions that it came with can be explained both as personal character-related issues, but also as objective and subjective factors of the moment. It is true that we don't make history in the circumstances of our own choosing. We make history in the circumstances that we find ourselves. So Mugabe, who at the end we could rightly say of his party, of his life, personal life, and we could say of the country that it's no longer at ease and the center cannot hold, faced a contest over the past because patriotic history could not cure the cleavages, the gaps in capacity, faith, the gaps in honesty and integrity, the gaps in skill, the numerous gaps that existed. And this is a lesson, Dr. Mandaza, for those who are fighting either for democracy or a vision of the future. That sheer passion and commitment, ideological erudition is insufficient to run a state. That the business of running a state takes a measure of skill, managerial competence, and leadership commitment. So when we judge the legacy of Mugabe, we must center not purely on political leadership, but on statecraft and state leadership. But we must commend him for having brought the professionals like yourselves, because this is foresighted. But we must also castigate him for, after many years, he began to throw away the professionals and to politicize the civil service, politicize local authorities in a way that took away the capacity to deliver, the capacity to envision, the capacity to implement. But there was a contest towards the latter days, Dr. Mandaza, over state accumulation, or the state as a site of accumulation. The hollowing out of the state that we see was not only the outcome of the imperial policies of structural adjustment, it was also because the comrades had joined the imperialists in taking everything valuable out of our country, including the future of our children, and taking it to the imperial centers or to new centers in Asia and the Middle East. There was contest over the generational shift and succession that was mismanaged. The leadership in the liberation movement never believed it would grow old. If it did, it never understood that young people of the generation they had liberated would, like them during their own youth, be restless, positively discontented, or simply, as some say, never underestimate the condescension of posterity. Because posterity does not see the crickets, the snake, the frogs, and the difficulties of the caves you sleep in when you fight for liberation. Posterity can only judge you on the basis of their comfort or discomfort. But there was too the South African effect. Mugabe presided over an island of excellence. As South Africa gets independence, South Africa takes the limelight. But South Africa also grabs industries. But South Africa does much more. It draws international capital to a new center, to a new Darwin. And the deliberate sabotage, because at the time, we could all say many things. I think that those who write and study must look at the effect, that it was not just a contest over the SADC organ between Mugabe and Mandela. There were huge contests over who is the real hegemon in the region. And in there lies a challenge that speaks to character and personality, the inability to adapt and to pivot. So how might we judge Mugabe? And I'm preparing to end. Avoiding the dangers of a single narrative. Well, Mugabe postponed racial injustice in exchange for power, or what he believed was amity, as indicated in his great speech issued on the 4th of March. But those of you who were alive and seized with the moment will say only a fool can suggest that Mugabe could have taken any other path, because the brittleness of the situation in 1980, the likelihood of resilient back into war was such that he could not take reckless actions. But as I said, posterity doesn't have the comfort of the moment. It has the discomfort of its own moment. Lack of food, lack of jobs, lack of educational opportunities, and essentially an abysmal lack of futures. It is a posterity that was raised by Fei Chung and Ibo Mandaza and Mugabe hold that education and hard work was the pathway to liberation. But it is a posterity that observes children of the rich, cronies of the rich, who neither have education nor hard work, live the most lavish lifestyles, enough to gift the rest of society, milking the state. So Mugabe's legacy of education, of hard work, has been belied by those in his own party who have mistaken liberation for accumulation and conspicuous consumption and show off as the essence of being the ruling class. Nyika inotongwa nevene vayo. There is no longer Gutsaru Jinji. There is now Zimbabwe Inc. That is a legacy that Mugabe may have unintentionally left. But Mugabe felt insecure at a personal level. The entire region was being destabilized by South Africa and CIA-sponsored entities, whether it's Renamo or other juntas, or, let's be clear that despite this fact, Mugabe cannot escape the scourge of guilt that comes from Gukuraundi. Mugabe grew and shrunk the Zimbabwean economy. Those that want to refer to doomsday and Mugabe's failure dare not dispute simple figures, which were how he grew the education sector. Well, it wasn't him as a person, but it was his leadership presiding over the state. Those who look at all his other evil qualities must remember Mugabe made Zimbabwe popular. Wherever you go, whether you're in New York or in Mali, when you say Zimbabwe, they say Mugabe. But Mugabe also made Zimbabwe infamous and the laughing stock, children crossing into South Africa risking being chewed by crocodiles, and all the other debased things that our people now do. The most literate country in Africa at some time has become the one country that can't fix simple problems, because our literacy has at its core another one of Mugabe's legacies. When Mugabe arrived in Mozambique, we are told one of the first institutions he closed was the Vashandi, the ideological colleges. An ideologue threatened by ideological posture. But that's not all. Mugabe, an astute, highly literate man, also has another challenge. Raises a government of thugs where anti-intellectualism became a centerpiece within his own party. But anti-intellectualism became a centerpiece of our politics. Udofo and ignorance became the driving force and was conflated and mistaken for simplicity and proximity to the masses. And yet, to run a modern economy, to make the sort of calculus or calculations that enable you to do the energy mix that you were talking about, Faye, to address the question of electricity, to address the question, you require a measure of intellectual rigor and managerial and leadership competence. So Mugabe, the astute literate man, the visionary leader, may have been a poor manager. When you look at infrastructure, water, electricity, and transport, was this the failure of imagination or the destruction of imagination? Let me explain. You see, Mugabe was not short of imagination. It is sometimes when the leader sees there must be a team to do. When you remove the team, it does not matter how much the leader sees. It is a mere vision. A vision is a combination of a wish and a vision. As they say, wishes are not donkeys, and no one can ride them. Mugabe's social spending that produced great educated folks and doctors has become the heritage of South Africa, of his neighbors, and the rest of the world. Because the poor governance and management of Zimbabwe as an economy and a country has essentially driven Mugabe's greatest heritage, which was literacy, professionalism, to others, because our own country no longer values professionalism. But Mugabe was not a system. He was a single person. And I want to suggest that what we are saying today as we reflect on him, we would have to be disciplined enough to say, like all of us, here was a man with grave and great weaknesses. Here is a man who caused grievous harm to us, but here is also a man whose redeeming good features perhaps may constitute the basis upon which we build our own greatness. Mugabe is no longer here. It doesn't matter how much we blame him. Those of us who are alive are observing with splendor how several years after Mugabe left power, what remains, what we thought would redeem us from what we thought was a man-made disaster by a single man, has resulted in greater darkness at noon. My friends, I did not purport or wish to give a partisan speech. I simply wanted to say, isn't it ironic that Mugabe becomes hated by the white world because his party says we're taking land from white people and giving it to black people, and we will not pay compensation if Britain does not pay. And that becomes his place of death, or his place of where he nailed his political destiny. And his successors come and they do exactly the opposite. Isn't it ironic that the same Mugabe said, Blair, you can have your Britain and I'll have my Zimbabwe? Would rather have dignity in starvation than servitude in acceptance. And yet today we give everything away, wetlands, we give away the most valuable minerals, not to create jobs, but to create uber-rich folks, criminals who hide within and behind liberation and democratic parties in order to disembowel the very futures of Zimbabweans. My friends, it is not out of hatred that I raise the question of inconsistency. A ruling party without ideological compass, an opposition which may have lost its GPS signal, is a country in crisis, not just a leadership crisis, but a moral crisis, an ideological crisis, and a crisis of perception and vision. So there is an impasse, and that impasse is one up here. Being a great people means that we derive from not just Mugabe, but the generation of liberators that were with him, Faye, yourself, Joshua Mkabu Nkomo, Tongo Gara, and others. And as Faye, many of you have reminded us, posterity will valorize those who died, but they were imperfect men. Men with many weaknesses, with many horrible attributes. But it is this very story that it is these imperfect men and women that brought us to this point of liberation. Their imperfections we must never hide, but their contribution we must never deny. I agreed to come here because it would be treacherous and it would be dishonest for us to simply say Mugabe can only be known for Gukraundi. And it will be equally treacherous for us to say Gukraundi never happened. And to start arguing about the numbers. Gukraundi happened. And our history has these wrinkles, these blood stains, these screams and cries of pain, bones that are buried in shallow graves, people assassinated for political difference, but our history also has the moments of unity that you described. Our history has hope. I thank you, Dr. Mandaza, for inviting me to celebrate a person who I opposed politically, but a person whose contribution to who we are as a country should not be denied purely because we differ politically. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian, for a beautiful presentation. You have redeemed yourself by turning up today. And, and you are, of course, recorded. Mistaken reparation for accumulation. Government of thugs. Criminals hiding behind liberation credentials. Very strong words. And I think the point being made here is that Mugabe has to be considered not only as an individual, but an individual in the context of a historical process, in particular, in the context of a state that is Zimbabwe, a state which cuddled him only to throw him up when it was convenient, a state which, as Brian has just said, bereft of any ideological compass, driven by accumulation, and a state and a party, I might add, which has no sense of history. I mean, I was just reflecting today that, are you aware that the founders of ZANU, all of them died having left ZANU? Nabandingi Stole, Mugabe himself, even refused to be buried at Hirozeka, where a grave was anointed for him. And Morris Nyagumbo, Edgar Tekere, Enos Inkala, Motor Malianga, all of them died having left, in some cases not left, but cursed ZANU. It raised the question of the nature and content of these so-called political parties. And in our case, it raised the question of the nature of ZANU PF. Is it a party or just a platform for access to power, wealth, and the retention of both? Said. Let's bring our historian, Gerald Mazarire, tie things all together for us after this very strong presentations. Gerald Mazarire.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mandaza, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. Indeed, we are talking about one of the smartest politicians of his generation, an individual who was cerebral, articulate, and erudite, as Brian has just mentioned. And I think my response will be based on both the verbal renditions given here, as well as the pre-circulated paper given by Faye. And I think I'll just focus on about 4 things: the material and intellectual aspects that made Mugabe who he was, trying to put it in a historical context. I'll also touch on the ideological aspects that have been mentioned by the last 2 speakers, his strategy, and also the circumstances that made him central to his party and the state, indeed, to the point of actually personifying it. So I think to start with, without necessarily conflating the issues of ideology and his experience as an intellectual, I want to take you to the time in Ghana or his experience in Ghana, and perhaps state that certainly he wouldn't pass for Nkrumah's, because Nkrumah himself really wasn't consistent in his ideology, starting off with positive action and non-alignment, but then towards the end of his career in the 1966, or before he was also removed by a coup, he had become radically very armed struggle-based kind of radical politician. And for Mugabe's experience in Ghana, I think it's important to mention that it was not only the intellectual part, but the kind of people that he met that also shaped his ideas and his character. I have been always interested in noticing the impact of such people as Tom Mboya on Robert Mugabe. When you listen to his oratory, when you listen to his mannerisms, they, to a large extent, actually mimic, if not at times, you can tell the kind of resonance and similarities with Tom Mboya's oratory. Mannerisms, accent, and all. It's very just interesting to see the videos when Tom Mboya speaks and you convey him to Robert Mugabe. The oratory is just striking. The other person, and I said I want to put this very much into historical context, is the person he actually encountered when he was in Ghana, and the inspiration that he took, especially in replicating typically Nkrumahist ideas and institutions. And this was Kamuzu Banda, who immediately became a leader of a country a few years just after leaving Ghana in 1961. And he established such things as the Young Pioneers Club and the youth movement that replicated what Nkrumah had in Ghana, which was actually based, I think Leo was talking about the 21st February movement. Nkrumah had a similar movement which was based on his birthday, and he was known as the Asegefo or the Redeemer. All these other aspects, all these other institutions like the Women's League, the Youth League, they replicate what actually is a very specifically Ghanaian experience. And this doesn't take away the idea that obviously Mugabe was his own man when he came to power. But the third point that you can also draw from his experience in Ghana is the idea of customizing the party constitution to the state constitution as a means of establishing a fairly extractive state. These are the same kind of things that you see that also result in the unceremonial removal of Nkrumah in 1966. So there are those parallels that I just thought maybe when engaging Faye's paper's presentation, we can take back to some of the ideological foundations that define and that make Mugabe in the long term. Which brings me to the point of ideology. And as I said, Mugabe shied away, and I think Faye did make that point as well, from public pronouncements of Marxism and Leninism, as much as he didn't write much about it. And we can really never talk of Mugabe as ideological leanings without mentioning Maoism and the commitment to a peasant struggle, in which armed struggle was at the center. This really radicalizes Mugabe. And apart from simply making him an ideologue, I think Mugabe can be viewed as somebody who had a methodology which made him speak or pander to different types of ideologies without actually making a commitment to one. And it is also something that made the Russians typically not so attracted to him. I think it was Leonid Brezhnev who, when ZANU tried to make overtures to get Russian funding, he simply said they should tell Mugabe to stop claiming that he's a Marxist, Leninist of Maoist orientation. So there were all these contradictions, again, which spoke to him trying to embrace different ideologies, but at the same time making no commitment to any. It reflects again the issue that I started with, that Nkrumah did the same, and in fact, you see that in many leaders in his position, this was also more of a methodology rather than a commitment to an ideology. There is also the element of Mugabe's strategy, the history of politics and of ZANU. And Faye does state that he was sensitive to ideas and prejudices of those he worked with, and then in the process developed his own views and judgments. But in this, I think he used a number of tactics, which I want to single out as the following. First and foremost, one thing you could not take away from Mugabe was that he had the memory of an elephant. He didn't forget that easily, and he used this consistently to make judgments of people and also circumstances that employed a very historical approach to his judgment. But secondly, you also use the strategy of rewarding. And to be fair, as both speakers have already indicated, he gave everyone a chance. And if you look at the patterns, for instance, with the independence, nearly every ZANU technocrat was made a senior civil servant. I'm talking of people like Dr. Mandaza and others. Every member of the ZANLA general staff was made into a senior commissioned officer in the security forces, be it in the Army, Air Force, police, prison. And thirdly, every ZANU representative was made into an ambassador. And nearly all members of the Zimbabwe People's Movement, which I will talk about towards the end, were made actually governors. And this is a trend from the research that we're actually doing that shows that he remembered everybody and literally rewarded them at independence with the specific posts, which brings us to the point of the establishment of the extractive state. This was a process in which he was bringing people into the state to also gain the spoils of liberation, using the state as a resource. The third aspect of his strategy that I thought maybe we could also emphasize is punishing disloyalty. He was, to an extent, vindictive when it came to people that either betrayed him or that he disagreed with. Nearly all the Zipa cadres at independence were not accommodated in either the state system or the party. The careers of Stole and Zorewa and all those people who were a part of the internal settlement are there for everyone to see. But lastly, that was also able to rehabilitate those who accepted or who repented, who accepted his power or who repented. And he used this as also a process of consolidating his power. I also wanted to come to the issue of prison politics that Faye discussed in the pre-circulated paper. And it's interesting that as far as the history of the partisan is concerned, a lot of these areas about what happened in prison and the outcome and how eventually Mugabe became emerged leader out of the prison politics is something that really is interesting as far as research on this subject is concerned. And I think it goes back to 1970, something that I've discussed in some of my work, where a rumor starts in prison. And this rumor is centered around the effect that Stole and Gomo were involved in unity talks, and they had agreed that they will give up their positions as respective leaders of ZAPU and ZANU and give rise to a new party, which will be led by Robert Mugabe. Coincidentally, this rumor was started by a British newspaper, and it also happened when Stole was in solitary confinement. Chitepo, interestingly, dismissed this in a press statement in 1971, and Stole himself denied that any such thing ever happened, any such meeting with Mugabe ever happened, to the extent that he also gave the statement that if ever there was going to be a new party, it should actually be led by somebody outside prison. So Stole at that time had been subject to visits by a special branch. And as far as these developments in prison are concerned, it's interesting that people ignore the fact that the kind of vibe around the rumor actually resulted in Mugabe's triumph, or in the rumor actually being vindicated. So the point that I just wanted to make is that both Chitepo and Tongogara, when they encountered the politicians who were in prison in Zambia when they were released, they are opposed to the idea of Mugabe triumph, to the idea of Mugabe deposing the existing leadership. On the one hand, Chitepo felt that Kaunda would use this as an excuse to expel ZANU out of Zambia. On the other hand, Tongogara, Mantaure, and other groups and other members of the ZANU High Command felt that this would actually be a betrayal of all that they had been doing in the struggle. In the long term, of course, Chitepo died just a few months later, and 3 years later, of course, Tongogara dies. But it's the dynamism of prison politics and how Stole eventually does not emerge as leader because of what happens from 1975 to 76, which saw the emergence of ZIPA. But it's important to understand that in all this, Mugabe is actually very quiet. It is not involved in any self-bidding, but circumstances actually happen that favor his rise. And it's interesting from a historian's point of view that none of this is actually emphasized at this point in terms of the rise of Mugabe, that a lot of people are speaking about his possible rise as early as 1970, and this comes into being in 1977 when he is confirmed by the Chimoio Conference. But I'll come back to that in a moment. What I just wanted to also emphasize is how Mugabe becomes the center of the party around this period, using elements or hierarchies that ensure that he becomes at the center of the party. And I think Faye's presentation talks about such things as the Logit scandal and the 1987 Unit Accord. But I think we can't discuss all those things in the understanding of Mugabe's power politics without going back to the 1984 ZANU Congress. And there are reasons why I say that, especially in relation to putting Mugabe at the center of the party, but also in consolidating the hierarchies that make up ZANU. So before 1984, or between 1977 and 1984, there are several defining features of hierarchies in ZANU. The first one being the pecking order, or the precedence in the party position, which is centered around party position, taking into account that each position from the 1964 Congress which was the cornerstone of ZANU, is that each position is actually a number, or it's actually part of the pecking order from president, vice president, chairman, secretary, and so forth and so on. These are hierarchies that actually give numbers. So they also linked up with the seniority, sorry. And they are also linked to the prison coup, because the removal of Stole and the death of Takawira leaves Mugabe as the third and most eligible person to be leader of ZANU. But by 1984, a number of other factors have also come into place. Especially the idea of the Chimoyo Congress and how it changes the ZANU constitution, and this gives rise to the idea of 4 aspects that had to be taken into account into making the ZANU power. First one is the Darere Chimurenga, which had to be incorporated in the constitution itself. Political prisoners who were not at war, but who were still in Rhodesia, confined in Rhodesia. Exiles who were pushing ZANU's war effort from various areas in the United States, the United Kingdom, in Tanzania, in Zambia, and in Mozambique itself. And then lastly, the People's Movement, an underground movement that was championing ZANU's cause within Rhodesia. So by the time we get to the 1984 Congress, all these aspects of ZANU had to be incorporated. And that's why the 1984 Congress is all about restructuring and bringing the party to the people, but it's also about removing certain aspects of the constitution, like positions within it, such as the Secretary General. It's also about bringing a new party constitution that brings all these other aspects in it. But the most important part of the 1984 Congress is the ambiguity that it brings, that emphasizes, and that brings Mugabe at the center. And this is the idea of the first secretary, the conflation of other offices that would have, also the subordination of other offices that would have had independence within the party constitution, such as the commissariat and the idea of the organizing secretary. So by the time we get to 1987, or the unit accord that Faye talks about, we have a third set of hierarchies that are introduced. And this has to do with bringing in ZAP as a party that is actually swallowed or taken over by ZANU. And this results in the amendment of the party constitution and its customization to the state constitution. But the key thing, as far as Mugabe's legacy and his importance in this is concerned, is the idea of succession. Because by 1987, the whole idea of who should be at the center of the party centers around succession to Mugabe, who is already the incumbent president at that point. So the different methodologies of succeeding or replacing Mugabe are in place, and they have to do with either precedents, which we talked about, liberation war credentials, that is participation in the war for all, either ZAPU or ZANU people, and more importantly, ethnic balancing. So when we get the constitution beyond 1987, it is actually customized to bring Mugabe at the center, but also it's also meant to reflect or to make the party look like the state and vice versa. So to look at the period between 1980 and 2000 is uncontroversial, I think, as a face paper says, I think we need to problematize that and see it as also a very problematic period, which saw the consolidation of ZAPU and ZANU structures, and this confirmed Mugabe triumph. So that by the time we get to the 1990 elections, they are concerned with actually establishing the one-party state, but also doing away with the ZUM. And by the time we get to the 1995 elections, both the primary elections within ZANU and the main elections themselves, they are actually designed to page outspoken MPs within ZANU, and there are many examples of them. And so that by 1995, Mugabe's position is well entrenched, and a lot of people have actually been, and a lot of opposition has actually been neutralized. So to conclude, I think the year 2000 and its association with the land occupation movement must be understood within the context of a state that is under siege, but a party that has consolidated itself, given the dynamics that were taking place. But the point that I just wanted to conclude on is that the beginnings of the land invasion, so to speak, are related basically to the Soshe people, which was a restitutive agenda. In other words, it's people who were going back to their ancestral lands, people who were demanding ancestral land, but who were also frustrated with the typically constitutional processes that ZANU and the state were involved in reclaiming the land. But what happens then is that as the war veterans and ZANU embark on the fast-track land resettlement program, they completely forego and ignore the basis of the beginnings of this land invasion process, which was a restitutive agenda. And in the outcomes of the fast-track land, its implementation and outcomes and constitutional quantity, it does not take into account restitution, which is different from what happens in South Africa, where the restitution is actually part of the constitution. And what we had is a redistributive process, which actually I could say is a failure, because Zimbabwe now is the most expensive land, whether in urban or rural areas. But also it is, as we see with what is happening right now, the call for return to ancestral lands is actually back, and it's come back to bite the state, to the extent that we cannot be talking about a land reform process without restitution anywhere, whether in Zimbabwe or elsewhere. But as long as the country or the party went through a land reform process without a restitutive element, it became the albatross hanging on the legacy of redistribution that Zimbabwe and Mugabe championed in both their rhetoric in politics, as well as in their strategic discussions justifying the land reform program. So as far as the legacy is concerned, I think I'll also go with the education issue, and over and above just having so many educated people, the biggest diaspora of Zimbabweans are actually those educated people that we've been turned into a Pakistani, which relies, or which had to rely for the greater part of its GDP on the diasporic population that it sent out. I think I will end on that note and perhaps hear what others have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. This is wonderful historical piece that you have given us. Of course, all these are recorded, will be published. And as I said earlier on, General and I are working on the history of nationalism, in which some of these issues will be elaborated upon. Because I think we need to understand, I keep emphasizing the point, understand Mugabe or any person in history in the context of a process and the dynamics of whether it's party politics or whatever, or state politics for that matter. So we have some minutes to go. I will now ask the many who are on this platform to come up, make interventions, and I'll get back to my panelists to make the sum up 1 minute each at the end, which is soon. So, any hands up? I have some former ministers here. Walter Muzembe.
Thank you, Prof. Ibo, and all the eminent speakers that have spoken before. I think mine is just an appeal, perhaps to the Mugabe family, and I seek to convey it here through Leo. Good luck where he may have to take the message. But it is my submission that based on all the interventions that have been made today, that Mugabe can be a philosophy, can be an ideology that is distilled from everything that we have heard before today and will continue to hear in the future. And it is incumbent, of course, upon the family. I'm sure there was a background to why Mbeki chickened out and also some of the innuendos that you alluded to, Dr. Ibo, which could have a lot to do with perhaps the disposition of the family towards events like this. But they should lead, just like what Kwame Nkrumah's daughter is doing in Ghana, Sami, I think, Nkrumah. Start with a foundation with very clear objectives and goals, and invite people like I see here who are quite clear and eloquent and are doing a very brutal balance sheet on the legacy of Mugabe. So to Leo, who is also a lion like me, how do we feel about the 21st February movement celebrations which took place today, practically saying nothing about Mugabe, when it was conceived for the purpose of basically celebrating the values and ethos that he represented. So even his own colleagues in Africa, in the region, probably feel disabled by the family in failing to lead this agenda to hive out something positive about Mugabe's legacy. So while they buried Mugabe in a village, I think they should not continue to villagize him, because he was much more bigger than that. He was international. So it is a message that I'm asking Leo to take back to the family. Having said that, it is also clear that Mugabe was many things to many people. I think Kagoro eloquently dispatched that message. And we all remember him from our own different experiences with him. Whilst, of course, his closest coterie chose to wrap up his legacy as a villain after protecting his stay to a point of an overstay by removing him non-constitutionally through the coup that we all know, dressed as a resignation to avoid the attendant contagion. So they struck him when he was old and vulnerable, of course. So for the first 5 years of his successor stem, I think we're all very clear about what has been happening. A very intense re-engineering of Mugabe in the perception in the public and international mindset, which resulted in him being the villain that he became in the last 5 years. But there's also something positive that to hide from his legacy, which we all know. No one can under or dismiss his legacy in education, which was very eloquently described by all the speakers. No one can take away his legacy in championing the land reform, and no one can also take away his championship of some key internationalist issues like the Palestinian question and the protection of minority rights that he so eloquently discharged at international fora. So I would hope that going forward, Dr. Ibo, Prof. Ibo, we can have something more structured. This is a very good beginning, what we have done today, the seed you have planted, that formats itself in the manner that perhaps South Africans are doing when they have their lecture series on their own icons in their own country. And we can do it inside, outside the country, we can do it virtually, but I think we need the collaboration of the family. We need also to take the family to take agency to government on making sure that Mugabe's legacy is not buried in the village as is currently the case. What I see in just wrapping up is that we spent in the time that I was in government, which resulted of obviously Mugabe's own 37 years, a lot of time planning and accumulating plans and plans with very little implementation. Much and nearly all of what is being rolled out today by way of projects was conceived and planned under Mugabe, but there was little zeal for implementation. So he depended a lot on structure and teams, committees for implementation, but they also stalled the rollout of projects, and in some cases were actually sabotaged for political reasons. So his successor knows this mischief, and of course has turned into a micromanager for the reason of identifying implementation as a cost under Mugabe, who depended on structure to deliver. So there is a lot, I think, that we can put together under this Centenary project as a way forward to sustain a Mugabe legacy in the sense of remembering what he did, of course, wrong without forgetting. That shouldn't happen in the future, things like Gukraundi, but also distilling some important features of his legacy that should be sustained right up to the African Union. It is important to celebrate luminaries like Nyerere, but it is Mugabe himself who steered the Nyerere project at the African Union. And none of these founding fathers, their successors, nor anyone is a saint. So what is necessary is really a scholarly legacy balance sheet on luminaries like Mugabe, like Nyerere, championed by neutral persons like yourselves. And I think it will be necessary going forward as a consolidation of a legacy pack on people like Mugabe. I thank you, Dr. Ibo.
Thanks, Walter. Thanks very much. Is Lagoke, then Farai. Lagoke?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Professor Mandaza. My name is Nyakala Goke. I'm an Ivorian. I'm teaching in the United States. I just want to commend Ibo Mandaza for putting together this project. It's a beautiful conversation, well balanced. We heard different positions, and I came here because of Brian Kagoro, and who, by the way, did like an outstanding presentation. I don't have any contribution. I just have three little and brief questions. If the speakers can talk to that would be great. First question is about education. Just because I want to know if under Mugabe's rule, causes like the negritude of the ancient Egypt civilization, the negritude of the ancient Egyptian civilization was taught, if Pan-Africanism was taught like in schools in Zimbabwe. That's the first question. Second question, I did not hear too much about Mugabe's Pan-African legacy. I don't know if somebody can talk a little bit more about it. And the third one, I know that when I think Brian Kagolo talked about that a little bit, when Mandela came out of prison, it looks like there was a rivalry between Mugabe and Nelson Mandela. Mandela even said that it looks like Mugabe was not happy that Mandela, was freed. So I would like to know if the speakers can talk about those 3 points. Thank you very much, Professor Mandaza.
Yes, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Farai?
Thank you, Professor Mandaza, and thank you all the speakers. I missed the first part of the presentations, but I heard Kagoro and the other speakers. What I didn't hear is the impact of the economic structural adjustment programs on Mugabe's leadership style and personality changes that we saw. And also there is a public debate in Zimbabwe about the death of Sally, how it impacted Robert Mugabe. Many people saw changes in terms of the character, the way Mugabe related with the citizens of Zimbabwe, pre and post Sally Mugabe. And then back to the ISAP situation where Mugabe accepted the economic structural adjustment programs, which led to job losses and the growing militancy of the labor movement up to 1996. Many economists believe that 1996 was the best year of the post-independence Zimbabwe in terms of economic growth. And thereafter, Mugabe made two fatal mistakes. The first one was the DRC war, which was unbudgeted for. And the second one was the War Victims Compensation Fund, which again was unbudgeted for, leading to the Black Friday of November 1997, when the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange collapsed, crashed. Thereafter, I think Zimbabwe, or rather Robert Mugabe, was more concerned with the power retention project rather than the economy. And the formation of the MDC in September 1999 did not help matters. All these developments brought the worst of Robert Mugabe, such that beyond 2000, the economy was on a free fall. And instead of addressing the economic issues, state resources were now diverted towards the power retention projects. And most of the people who were around Mugabe beyond 2000, up to the time he fell, of course, they may have different views from the ordinary citizens, but there was kind of clientele politics where politics was now very transactional. People would, I think what Brian Kagoro talked about, there was no longer reward for professionalism in government. Those who sang Mugabe's praises louder were the ones who were rewarded with positions of power. That's why we see people like Joseph Chinotimba. He rises through beating captains of industry, assaulting them, violence on farms. He ends up being an honorable member of parliament. We see the rise of people like Boda Gezi, who were terrorizing citizens around the country. I can go on and on, but that's my submission that I agree with Brian that Mugabe must be understood in various historical epochs. There is the Robert Mugabe of the 1990s up to 1997, who was doing everything possible to lure investors, promote economic growth, to listen to the concerns of the citizens. And then there was the self-serving Robert Mugabe, 1997, up to the time he fell. That's all I can say. Thank you so much, Professor Mandas.
Thanks, Farai. We should give us more information about yourself. Many Farais. SK, you have your hand up. SK. My pseudonyms.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Mandaza. No, thank you very much. I think a lot has been said, and I want to thank the contributors, the panelists who came here, Dr. Chang, Brian, and the historian. I think there's very little we can take and try and modify from what has been said. But to acknowledge that this lecture was long overdue. This kind of debate where we look back and try to analyze Mugabe and many other people and many other leaders, of course, in the future is so important as we go forward. And I think, Doc, you must find a very creative way of making this annual lecture part of our calendar, if not even for a whole month. SA South Africa, the normal lecture will take a whole month, going to various universities, various speakers speaking. It's important for leaders, therefore, as they listen to the critiques that are being made in their journey to start correcting and adjusting certain issues. But I want to say, I think most of the speakers have given, like my colleague Dr. Mzembe said, a very balanced account of President Mugabe. He was a human being. Mugabe was not a machine. He was not a computer. He was a human being. And part of the mistakes that we all make are exactly what makes a human being. But apart from that, I think, I've just been reading a book by Ethel Kouya, which talks about African leadership. I think she picked 5 issues. A leader must be a worthy custodian. And I think it is very clear that Comrade Mugabe was a very worthy custodian of the people's struggle. He was a very worthy spokesperson. He was able to coalesce the various views, even in cabinet meetings or Politburo meetings. When he would articulate the positions, he would understand, even if he was in a disagreement, but each time he was to articulate a common position, he was somebody you could trust and say, this man knows what he's talking about. In other words, he's a worthy custodian of our struggle. He was also very responsible with influence. He had huge influence across Africa, like colleagues have been talking about, the Pan-Africanist, and I think the mistakes that we really all have to acknowledge, our foray to the DRC, even though it was a necessity in terms from a Pan-Africanist
Can you explain dumber language? I'm not really understanding right now.
Our country was not very, very ready to be able to carry out such a huge exercise. But there's other areas as well where you have to accept President Mugabe's ability to listen to wise counsel. I want to confirm that I spent almost about 17 years sitting with him in the Politburo. In as much as people will look at him as a tough man, he was somebody who could be persuaded if you had your facts and if you felt differently, but could put across your point of view, he could be persuaded. And I think he was also a very curious person. Look at what he did in terms of the technology. He brought in the computerization of our schools way, way before many people could understand what he was trying to do. You also look at what he did with most of our kids who were sent to Fort Hare University, various universities. We have all of a sudden now created a whole generation of well-educated Zimbabweans. But I think one area where we did not serve him well was to advance the empowerment, the economic empowerment, the creation of a new architecture for the people of Zimbabwe. This is something I think that Mugabe was yearning for. Mugabe wanted to see the control of our economy in the hands of the majority of our people. Not that those who are in there must leave, no, but that we should expand it for it to be able to meet the basic necessities of our people, as well as create opportunities for our people. And I think this is a very tragic, I think, because as Mzembe says, one of the things that is coming to light as we reflect on our stay in government was the undercurrency of concerted efforts to sabotage and undermine President Mugabe. I want to confirm that for the past 10 years, the last 10 years of his rule, there was nothing he could do which was not being undermined. At every turn, there were jackals who were looking at how best to sink and really just make things not work. You recall variously how people would say each time he went abroad to Singapore, he's sick, he's dying, and so forth. There was this very clear and elaborate plan to see to it that Mugabe left the office. And I think it's such a disservice, it's unfair when, as a nation, we want to be moving forward. And I want to conclude, Dr. Mandaza, by acknowledging that, the land reform program has been one major serious transfer of wealth from the hitherto farm owners to the majority of Zimbabweans. Not that all the land that was taken by the farm owners, from the white people, has found itself in the hands of the majority, but even the rural communities, the production of tobacco, for instance, the figures are talking about 300 million kgs. 70% of that is coming from the Black people. And if you do the numbers, over $1 billion, the transfer of wealth into the hands of our people is massive. But the unfortunate part is that the Liberation Project fails to plan after liberation. What do we do next? What is clear from Dr. Chang's presentation was there was a very clear program that you mastered and managed after independence: social development, education, health delivery institutions. But the economic architecture going forward is where we now need all of us as Zimbabweans to grapple with and do something about it. But otherwise, Dr. Mandaza and Professor, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks very much, Moyo. Thank you. I have four last contributors. Dr. Cassius Lubisi from South Africa, my colleague. Vitalis, Munyarazi, and Tony, in that order. Dr. Lubisi.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mandaza. Greetings from the Republic of South Africa. And greetings to all our comrades on the African continent and in the diaspora in the United States and everywhere. I wish to first congratulate you, Professor Mandaza and SAPES, for organizing this very important centenary of Comrade Robert Gabriel Mugabe. I am very heartened by the diversity of views and the contextualization of the period in which Comrade Mugabe operated. As you know, there is an African saying which says, until the lion tells his side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. It is quite unfortunate that we have not seen in Zimbabwe in a big way, which includes all stakeholders, the recognition of this day. President Mugabe was a very complex figure, extremely complex. And the complexity has come to the fore today. And I'm sure with greater discussion, you will see this complexity. Let me say why I speak. I could have listened carefully. I happen to be Director General in the Presidency of the Republic of South Africa and Secretary of the South African Cabinet for 10 years. And I've interacted with President Mugabe for many years in various bilateral meetings, as well as part of the African Union. Incidentally, and ironically, currently as I am now retired, I was requested by the Department of Home Affairs to assist them to deal with the issue of the Zimbabwe exemption permit, where we are dealing with 178,000 Zimbabweans who were given a special exemption permit to reside in South Africa because of very difficult conditions in Zimbabwe, so that we can, in a way, sort out their stay in South Africa, or those who do not have the correct documentation or forged documentation can then be asked to return home to sort out such documentation, and we find quite a lot of those. I also speak in my capacity as the chief technical organizer of the funeral of President Nelson Mandela. I led the organization of that funeral. And always we were very clear that there are very many stakeholders that owned President Mandela. Firstly, the family owned President Mandela. Secondly, the government, on behalf of the people of South Africa, owned President Mandela. We also understood that the African National Congress, as his organization, owned President Mandela. We also understood that the international community, including the African Union and the United Nations, owned President Mandela. And we had to bring all these parties together. It was not easy. We had to bring them all together in order for us to all understand what we need to do as we prepare to bury President Mandela. And we started this process 8 years before President Mandela died. And he himself participated in this process. Now, it seems to me that the absence of consensus among the key stakeholders in Zimbabwe is going to cause the hunter story to dominate the legacy of such a complex figure as President Robert Gabriel Mugabe. And I would urge everyone in Zimbabwe, including all the various figures within ZANU PF. Comrade Xavier Kwasikwere has just spoken now on his views. Comrade Leo spoke earlier on the role. Of course, Comrade Faye Chung spoke, first Minister of Education in Zimbabwe. I remember her very well. Now, we need to reconcile among ourselves, even if it is for a short time, to ensure, and government has to play a role in this, because if government doesn't play a role, this becomes very difficult to sustain. Indeed, in South Africa, we were helped by the fact that during Mandela's life, we managed to create the Nelson Mandela Foundation, which we worked with and we continue to work with to keep the legacy of President Mandela. Now, Mandela himself was no angel. So it becomes very important that we have to put our village politics to the side and look at 100 years from now. All of us will be dead on the 21st of February in 100 years' time. All of us will be dead. And the question becomes, whose story becomes dominant? Is it the hunter or the lion's story? Let's come out of this small town politics, because if you look at the future with today's perspective, and you don't look at the future in your absence, you start making mistakes as to how your story will be told. So I would strongly agree that a foundation of sorts, which captures the strengths, limitations, legacy of President Robert Mugabe, be established, and be brave enough to approach the current leadership of ZANU PF. Be brave enough to approach the leadership of the family, of the Mugabe family. Comrade Leo spoke earlier on about all the issues, the communication issues that made it impossible for some members of the family to join in. All I'm calling in the South African tradition is for unity of purpose and unity in action. Otherwise, your history will be told by someone else in the manner in 100 years' time that if you were to rise from your graves, you would be horrified how you are constructed as a nation. Not only President Mugabe, but the whole of a generation of Zimbabweans that you are. You are lucky that you have had the opportunity to interact with the man, to interact with his cabinet and other colleagues of his and comrades of his. From the time he went into exile, as Comrade Faye say, with those 7 degrees, the stay in Mozambique, the support of the leadership of the frontline states to end apartheid in South Africa. The various roles that Comrade President Mugabe played on the African continent. In the AU, I can relate stories about his chairmanship of the AU, but we don't have the time. Some of them were behind the scenes. I can tell you some of the things that he has done and which count in his favor. I have written very, very harsh articles about on President Mugabe's tactics sometimes, which I felt were really problematic. However, as I said, he is a complex figure, and the complexity in our recital of his history should come through. He was not a one-dimensional person, and we need to get this complexity in its whole, rather than getting different oppositional ideas, which seem to suggest that we are dealing with a linear human being. So that's what I thought I should contribute today in my small capacity from the south of the Limpopo River. Thank you very much to everyone, the former ministers, Comrade Ibo, and everyone who participated in today's memorial. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry to have taken a long time.
Right. It was worth listening to. Thanks, Cassius. Thanks very much. See you next week. Vitalis, Nyarazi, Tony, and Tanaka. Tanaka is a grandchild.
Thank you so much, Prof. Ibo, and thank you very much to everybody. I've got two short issues. The first one, maybe that's what was your plan before.
Who's speaking? Who's speaking?
This is Vitalis.
Okay, Vitalis. Okay.
I was suggesting that you used to use those SAPES papers. Can you do one on this topic? You put the presentations that were done today and then ask other contributors to come in, and you come up with a document that at least our people can read, even Africa can read, and the young generation also needs to know, because there's a lot of issues that came out that even I, an old person, didn't know about. So I think documentation of this will be fantastic. And I give
is just to appreciate the ability of the late Robert Mugabe to make strategic reconciliations, starting with working with being able to work with Ian Smith in 1980, and reconciling with Joshua Nkomo in 1987, and most recently in 2009 through the GPA. That ability to make those strategic and necessary reconciliations for the common good, I think that's what we are looking for. If you look at the issues that are affecting us as a nation, post Mugabe era up to now, the failure for leadership to really find each other after challenges for the common good, I would say, as we reflect on the men, that's my striking reflection of Robert Mugabe. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think Tony, you know, Tanaka, grandchild, Mugabe's grandchild. Tanaka. 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 Not there. Alan Walker.
It's okay. I've asked him to unmute. Please can speak now.
Tanaka.
Hi. Sorry, I could not unmute myself. I don't have much to say. I think most of the things have been mentioned, and I just want to thank you, Prof. Mandaza, for going ahead with the event, although it didn't take the shape that we had hoped. Just to maybe make a commentary on the point that Dr. Muzembe made about the family taking the lead. I'd actually seen a comment as well that I just want to reiterate, that because RGM was a public figure, he was an icon, and we cannot regulate his legacy or his role that he played in the hands only of family or government. Because if we do that, then we are failing to be the scholars or intellectuals that we claim to be by addressing the issues that we've been addressing. So including family into this or government, I don't think it should be a bridge or a blocker to us having these discussions, or us even celebrating, let's say, a memorial lecture for Robert Mugabe. I've never heard anything of that happening. But I think it's a task that we can task ourselves, whether family or not, to say, what are the universities doing? How are we bringing him into the scholarship of our learners as he was a scholar, or into politics, whichever platform that we see him fitting in and in which we want to discuss his contribution. I don't think it should be limited to asking for permission, whether to government or the family. Otherwise, like Dr. Muzembe said, he will remain buried in the rural areas, and everything that he worked for will not, will not see the light of day. So if it means, Prof. Mandaza, we have to have, let's say, a memorial lecture at Forte. He was an icon at Forte. I'm also an alumni of Forte, and I think many others are alumni of Forte. And we grow that memory and that scholarship of the man he was, to grow his legacy as a scholarship that we can critique and we can even, discuss and affirm, which then, affirms his legacy. So family or no family, government or no government, I don't think it should limit us. Let's take an example from his leadership. Nothing limited him. He wasn't limited by, all the sanctions or all the comments that people made about him. They still moved. So this is just to salute you for just, persevering with this thought process and just saying that if anyone has similar mind frames, similar agendas in terms of putting him as a topic of discussion or celebrating or even presenting his ideologies as a point of critique, then it must be done. His legacy is encompassed by both, controversy and everything, and it should be placed in the open. So I think we should not limit ourselves to seeking permission necessarily. I'm saying this not as a family member, but as a scholar who's also very equally fascinated on engaging on the topic of, the person he was and how we reflect to the legacy left and what we can learn from him going forward. Yeah, thanks.
Peter, we never asked for permission from anybody. What we did was simply inform people. And since we're inviting a former head of state, there are certain protocols that one has to go through. And we all were asking government to facilitate that, but we never asked permission. And even after Grace Mugabe refused to have anything to do with this, we're going ahead anyway. We told her that, and we've gone ahead. Yeah, so we'll take the suggestions made. I'm sure there'll be others who will follow up. But thanks, Tanaka, and thanks for coming on board. You and your father did very well. We appreciate that very much for your support. Tony Rila, with the last speaker. Tony. David, unmute Tony. David.
Yes, I've asked him to unmute.
Thank you. Okay, speaking as a long-term citizen of this country of pale complexion, it struck me that what is really interesting about this historical discussion is that Robert Mugabe is seen in two ways. He's seen as a person who internally was a redeemer and then rejected. And it strikes me that the rejection is because of a problem that went on a long time ago, and we've got some seriously awful stuff on the screen, but anyhow, I'll carry on. And that's related to something that you raised at the beginning, and that is that the succession problem that bedeviled Robert Mugabe for his whole life, all the way to 2017, was something he had to deal with internally, and for which he is now repudiated. When people talk about he's not remembered today, he is not remembered today because he's repudiated potentially as the person who's responsible for our internal problems. He's also a person who was greatly admired internationally, still is internationally, as a spokesman for the Third World, for the non-aligned movement, for the struggle against Israel, etc., and then is repudiated because he is seen as the problem for all the internal problems in Zimbabwe. Now, the history that has to get unpacked is what, as Brian pointed out, what historical context was Robert Mugabe dealing with epoch after epoch after epoch? He was dealing with being a frontline state and leading to the liberation of the Southern African region, and was then abandoned when he discovered that the major project was nothing about Zimbabwe. It was about the liberation of South Africa and the establishment of international capital. So it's a very complex problem when you analyze Robert Mugabe. And I think that one of the things that you have to disentangle is the man with his strengths and his weaknesses and the historical context and the economy of what he had to deal with. That's the balance that I'm hearing in small strands here, and we have to disentangle the man from the context. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'll go back to my panelists if they're still there. I'll begin with Brian and end with Faye. Brian, Agoro, 1 minute, your last shot. And if you can also deal with the questions raised by Farai and by Lagoke. Brian, maybe you can deal with Lagoke. And then Gerald, maybe we'll deal with Farai's questions. Although Farai's questions were less questions than statements of fact. Brian there? Brian Kagoro? Unmute Brian, please. David, unmute Brian.
Okay.
Thank you, colleagues. Let me start, Dr. Mandaza, by telling you a little tale. 12 US presidents owned slaves at some point of their lives. 8 owned slaves while in office. 10 of the first 12 American presidents owned slaves. And the president who owned the highest number of slaves was Thomas Jefferson. He owned more than 600 slaves. The second who owned more was George Washington. Now, why did I tell you this? The conversation about Robert Mugabe is a conversation about struggle, triumph, atrocity, and failure. It's a story of the human endeavor, but it is a story of circumstances. It's a story of personal weaknesses. It's a story of dysfunctional systems, but it's also a story of innovation, amongst other things. And what all of us have tried to say to this collective is whether the judgment you wish to give is one of Mugabe mania that looks only at those aspects about Mugabe that are positive, or Mugabe phobia that looks at all those aspects that paint him based on his weaknesses. It really doesn't matter. The nation must have a conversation about Robert Mugabe, about Joshua Nkomo, about Chitepo, about Ndabaningi Stole, about Tongo Gara, that's centered around the leadership ethos. The leadership ethos that has defined perceptions, conceptions, and imaginaries of leadership, especially in this moment where leadership no longer has to prove that it was a victim or that it fought, where leadership can purely be based on celebrity, or leadership can be based on obtuse accumulation. Did the structural adjustment program affect Robert Mugabe? Yes, it did. Elsewhere, I have said that when we got independence, the ZANU PF government had 2 choices: level up, which means bring all Black people to the same level of white people whose lives were more comfortable and lavish for the most part than the A-listers in Hollywood, or level down. Try and do such things that bring everybody to some equitable platform. We decided to level up, and we created a Black elite that aspired to be white, the new Varungu, Wazungu, Makiwa. This creation of the Black elite is not unique to Zimbabwe. I saw my brother, Comrade Cassius. This is the struggle you are facing in South Africa. We saw it in Angola, we saw it in Mozambique. That liberators who aspire for this whiteness based on primitive accumulation inevitably must treat the masses the same way white minority regimes treated the masses, as enemies. as a security threat for containment. That's number one. But number two, that liberation, and this is the legacy we're talking about, it's about, Dr. Mandaza, the state as a centerpiece in the transformation of the general plight of the people, right? Mugabe got it rhetorically, but unfortunately the state got repurposed, as others have said, Kaskwere and others, repurposed by the mafia at the core of the ruling elite, repurposed the state for personal accumulation, for building fiefdoms. He was not entirely innocent himself in these particular shenanigans, right? Number three, it is the use of instruments, coercive instruments, the police, the army, right? How does a liberatory or liberation party use coercive apparatus in the moment of liberation? Tragically, ours was used not only for the containment of opponents, but sometimes for the extermination of difference. And then three is the question of leadership and power in the it's not really post-colonial, in the post-independence moment. Mugabe typifies the dilemma of existing in a moment of economic adversity. What was that moment for I? 1979 to 1989, the rise of neoliberalism globally, and the notion that there was no alternative except neoliberal globalization, and the push towards hollowing out the state, the push towards managerial statehood that did not engage or invest in the social services. This was a doctrine within the World Bank and the IMF. It is a doctrine that was being force-fed to developing countries, whether or not they had claims of being revolutionary. Now, did this affect Mugabe? When you take land away from a peasant, what do you call the dispossessed person? When you take away the ability to engage in social redistribution and economic redistribution from a person who claims to be a revolutionary, what do you call a Black leader who cannot do social and economic redistribution for the benefit of their people, to empower their people who had been historically dispossessed by colonialism, by racism, and etc.? But there is something we did not mention. The evolution of Mugabe with respect to the question of gender justice, women's rights in particular. His views were totally backward at some stage. And we saw some evolution for him to become one of the first few presidents on the continent to appoint a female vice president, and to have appointed in his cabinet in 1980 young ladies, young women who were in their 20s into cabinet, is either a sign of enlightenment, Faye, or we can say if it was a mistake, a benign mistake. But we must, in looking at his legacy of empowerment and his personal evolution, also begin to ask ourselves the circumstances that shaped him. The women who were within the liberation movement, the women who were within women's movements that shaped. Lastly, Mugabe and youth. And this tale, whether it's the Red Brigades that went after ZAPU and Zipra, or it is the Green Bombers, there is a curious relationship that developed because Mugabe has a multiple set of relationships with young people. And this first set of relationships, Dr. Mandaza, is Mugabe who looks to ensure young people are educated, young people are disciplined, but Mugabe who also enabled and allowed young people to engage in the defense of power in acts of violence and dehumanization of the other and of opponents. Lastly, it's Mugabe the internationalist. I think we can all struggle on whether a Pan-Africanist must be a purist, must be pure, a Pan-Africanist must be without blemish. If we are judging purely on the basis of the context one lives in, my brother Gerald, there is now declassified CIA files that indicates that there was active disinformation and misinformation. You don't have to believe me, just look at what the CIA have said themselves about Nkrumah, creating in the Ghanaian psyche that Nkrumah was such a threat. America feared this threat of communism and therefore created anyone who purported to be communist or socialist as an arch evil. Yes, Ibo, I'm about to conclude. So in essence, Mugabe was situated in a global context of ideologies between the East and the West, between the left and the right, but a global context where there was no truth, where either side went out of its way to tarnish the other, to paint the other as the arch-evil. Dr. Mandaza, we are back in that global moment where the contestation, including the attempt to use technology, misinformation and disinformation to determine what people think, not just about their countries and their leadership, but about other countries and other leaderships, is at the centerpiece. We should not naively as Africans accept as gospel truth everything that's deployed either as knowledge, information, or communication. And this is not to absolve the likes of Mugabe and Nkrumah of any excesses, but it is simply for us not to be naive. I work at the coalface of constraining disinformation, and I'm amazed by how little even I knew about the machinery that creates counter-reality in order to govern Africa, to capture Africa, and to retain dominance over its resources.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks very much indeed. Your contribution to this is widely acknowledged. Gerald, very brief.
Thank you. I don't have much to say really, but to thank.
You're feeling.
It's getting colder. Yeah, but I was saying, well, I just wanted to respond to a question raised about whether Mugabe allowed certain things to be taught in universities. And I think my response to that is certainly, apart from his commitments to Marxism, Leninism, and so forth, he didn't preside over a Stalinist government. In other words, his regime did not ban books. For one thing, part of his credit is non-interference in intellectual processes, particularly what was going on at universities. Except, of course, the time when the Use It Amendment Act is given in 1990. But that did not necessarily interfere with what was taught in universities. The flip side of that is part of his legacy in education is that he also presided over the spread and increase on the number of universities that ended up diluting the quality of higher and tertiary education in the country. And that is an issue that really has to be engaged with in the long term as to what did this imply on the level of access to education for everyone on the one hand, but on the other, the quality of education that is taught in our universities. So that's my response to that. And the question, I think, came from Nake relating to his Pan-African profile. I think one can make a very big distinction between a very active Pan-Africanist in Mugabe in the early periods of his rule, of his tenure as both prime minister and president, where his participation in the non-aligned movement, frontline states, and even indeed in the formation of SADC and its activities. And I think somebody mentioned his role in the liberation of South Africa in particular, which is really understated in many scholarship on this subject, his involvement in Mozambique and so forth. But there is a distinction with the latter part of his profile as a Pan-Africanist, where indeed is more of a rhetoric or rhetorician or who panders to Pan-Africanism more than he participates directly, because he is saying a lot in his rhetoric and acting the other way, as Brian has just mentioned, in terms of his commitment to uplifting the African, starting with what is happening at home and starting with what he's doing to enhance the livelihoods of Africans in his own country. So I think you can make those clear distinctions between the earlier Mugabe and the later Mugabe, who is known for his speeches and rhetoric rather than his action. I think those are my two main responses, and I want to just acknowledge the point raised by Brian, that yes, part of what I've really been talking about is stuff coming from declassified American, British, and other archives, but also as far as Nkrumah is concerned, the Bureau of African Affairs, all the institutions that he presided over in Ghana, they're actually releasing lots of documents that we have access to. So it's going to be fun really looking at these Pan-Africanists and these African leaders in the short term, because lots of information is becoming available. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. Thank you to bring you out in the cold. Thank you very much indeed. Faye, the last word from you.
Thank you very much. I just have 3 points. Firstly, I mentioned that even when the gross domestic product or economy of Zimbabwe doubled in 2018, it seems the state and all the political parties were taken by surprise, and there was no policy and program to take into account the fact that we were so short of money for 20 years, and suddenly we could have a bit of money, but still we were begging for donor funds, even though donor funds had been denied for more than 10 years. I think we need to look at the role of the state and of all the political parties, not just ZANU PF, in terms of things like the policies, the state of the gross domestic product, and the issue of funding by government to banks through which the private sector could access what are basically part of the nation's wealth. The second thing is the fact that one of the weaknesses of ZANU PF and of all the political parties in Zimbabwe is populism. There is, when the popular feelings are against the policy, let's say against socialism, we go with the popular feeling and start attacking socialism. I think we have to see that as a weakness of the country as a whole, that we are mixing up populism, being popular, with being democratic. And finally, I think it's an important point to look at the details of policies and plans. We shouldn't be happy to say this is a capitalist plan or this is a socialist plan. We should go into details why certain aspects of capitalism may make sense. For example, under the Rhodesian government, a certain amount was given to banks to provide low-cost loans for equipment and materials for private companies to expand. Now we banished all that. We said, no, government does not give much money to private banks, and we don't fund equipment of private companies. And that's why our private companies, whether agricultural or industrial, cannot actually expand. When we say that after 40 years, we don't have any new companies, I think one of the reasons is the fact that we didn't have the details of how state funds are being used. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Faye. Thanks also for your paper, which we are distributing. And we're taking the suggestion made by one of the people who intervened that we need to put a document, a little book together to mark this particular session, but also to as a way of marking Mugabe's centenary. So thank you very much indeed. So when you finish editing, maybe you can send us your paper. If there are any additions that you make, do so and send it to us in due course. Thanks very much. So on that note, I want to thank all of you who have participated with a good turnout today. There's nothing more to say. I think the three speakers and the contributors from the floor have said it all. Safe to say that we did what we resolved to do, namely to mark the centenary of a major political figure, a major factor in our history as Zimbabweans. In the tradition that we have pursued before, we have marked the centenary of Nyerere 2 years ago, and Butchitepo last year. And we should continue to do that for our political factors, our historical figures. So thank you very much indeed. Until the next time we meet, good night, goodbye.